So it's difficult to be here. It's difficult to um, know what to say when our culture is going through our country and the world, but really our country is going through so much pain and confusion and chaos in this week. Where to start, where to begin? So I'm choosing to begin with a very brief how I've applied the principles to my life because I can only speak from what I know works from me, and then we'll go to the bigger picture. So, very quickly, I'm very blessed that my very first experience of the divine, like many of you, my very first experience of this divine light, this divine love, which I became completely one with, and it was transcendent, it was beyond all human form, came at a time when I was feeling the lowest, when I was feeling I had no value or I wasn't worth anything. I finally felt safe enough to experience and feel those feelings. And in the midst of it came God's infinite and extraordinary love and changed everything in a second, in a flash. And so what I appreciate about that, it wasn't my first experience of the divine wasn't in meditation, transcending into divine bliss or having an amazing experience, but I learned at a very early age that the divine is right there in the midst of the pain, that it's not separate. We don't have to make ourselves be better to experience the divine. The divine is right where we are. Whatever is happening, there this divine love is. As I grew older and as an adult, I would get into relationships. Now I have a family, a brilliant, wonderful family where my parents absolutely lived a life of principle. They lived in alignment with principle. I felt totally safe. I knew they were consistent and aligned. They were very rational, intelligent people. What my parents weren't always very good at is emotions. The emotions were sort of served them. It's not that they didn't have emotions. It served their principles. Everything came to the principle. So it's very mental and principle oriented, but there's a lot of emotions that just sort of got ignored. If they weren't serving, if they weren't strong, if they weren't productive was key, then there really was no point in feeling those feelings. So by the time I got to adult and in relationship, a lot of this stuff that was repressed or pushed down that I didn't even know had been pushed and upon started bubbling up. It started coming up. And there was a point where I did therapy, and that really helped me to understand my past. That was very important. The therapeutic aspect to go into the history of how my emotions were experienced growing up and how I evolved with them. But what interested me or scared me actually is when I got to a point in a relationship where even though I had done the work of the past, even though I knew spiritual principles, I was in New Thought, I knew the principles, I grew up in a family of principles, I knew the mental, I was still in a relationship where all these emotions were still in the present tense, impacting me to the point where I was not proud of my behavior. And it upset me because I just thought, well, I've already gone through the past. I've already cleared it. I know the principles, but nothing is touching my emotions in the present tense. And it's from that place that I really learned to surrender my life to this infinite oceanic love through my spiritual practices, through meditation, through exercise, which keeps me in my body and doesn't have me transcending, but keeps me present. And then through my journaling, which kept me expressing on a daily basis always in the awareness of the divine presence, sharing my emotions. And in that, I started finding my way of being present with my intense, I tend to be an emotional person, to be with my emotions on a daily basis, to find this divine love and to be in the emotions. And for me, it wasn't a task. It wasn't something I dread to do. I joy to do it because no matter what my emotional presence is, that I know that when I surrender it to the divine, when I feel it and surrender to the divine, it gets transformed. One of my first teachers of this was Barbara Mary Mull. She was a student of Joel Goldsmith, and she had said to Joel, I got the physical healing, that's not an issue. I got lots of money, that's not an issue. I'm doing creative work, I love my life, everything's going great, but it's in my relationships, it's in that emotional life that somehow I'm having a hard time practicing these principles. So she started using his principles to deal with emotional stuff, and it was from her, and he said, yes, teach this. And I took her class, and it was just extraordinary. And I know other people have said it since then, but she's the first person I heard say, this is she said it back in the 50s or 60s, you can't heal it if you don't feel it. That if we don't allow those emotions to come out in the presence of the divine and surrender it to the divine and allow the divine to heal those emotions, they're just going to get repressed. They're getting pushed away. We pretend they're not there. So we can be very efficient in our mind. We can be very efficient using the principles of science of mind, new thought, to create a reality we want. But the emotional life is a whole separate entity that we have to find the tools that work for us to heal it. And to heal it, we need to feel it. We need to go into that feeling. We can't ignore it or transcend it. So taking all of that, we have a whole lot of feelings coming up this week. I know I have. I know there's been a lot of tears, sadness. I know for my friends, for those of you who are people of color, it's been a lot of anger and rage immediately. And so all of these emotions are okay. If we don't feel them, they just get repressed again. So first of all, we have to if there's any part of us that is judging ourselves or other people, I'm inviting us, as Jerry was reading, to be more loving in our heart, that to open our hearts and to feel and know that all this pain isn't just coming out of nowhere. All this pain comes from a deep anger or rage, comes from a deep wellspring of pain that didn't just show up yesterday. So as I, again, was being with how to approach or how I wanted to be today, I've been listening to a lot. I've seen amazing things on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. I've just been reading articles, listening to interviews. I have heard so many great things, and there's no way I can either summarize it or do better. So I'm going to just speak from my own experience, and knowing that everyone, just as we all have our spiritual path, have our own experiences along this line. And it's to get us to the present day, how to be together as a community and as individuals in the present day. And I don't mean just the Lighthouse community, as citizens of this planet, how to be present. So for me, I went to a high school that was half African-American, half white, also very high Jewish percentage of people. And growing up, race was prevalent. It was something that we experienced day to day. It was something we talked about. There was definite struggles, there's definite pains with it, and there are amazing things that were just integrated without even thinking about it. It was just your classes, the sports, the activities, they were integrated. That was just part of life. When I was in 11th grade, I believe it was, I was invited to be part of a group that my classmates started called the Student Group on Race Relations. It's an extraordinary curriculum that they created, and I'm so honored that they invited me to participate. And in that, we would go back to the elementary schools and talk with the children about things that they were going to start experiencing as they got into middle school, as more and more of these, the different races were coming together. Some racial tension that many people experienced started happening in middle school. So we went to elementary school, and it's amazing. We taught the word, what does racism mean? What is prejudice? What is stereotype? And these are things that, even though I grew up in this environment, I knew to actually talk about it, have a structure to talk about what these definitions meant, what we experienced about it. Then we gave them role playing situations that they may come across when they got to middle school, some racial tensions and how they would deal with it. It was an extraordinary program, so extraordinary, in fact, that I was just reading an article in the Washington Post a few months ago talking about the school system where I was raised and talking about the Student Group on Race Relations. 35 years later, it's still going. So what that gave it to me was just not only I was living a life that was in a racial experience, white and black, and how we all lived together and grew together and struggled together, that and I learned through the Student Group on Race Relations. Then when I went off to college, that energy was still with me. And another classmate said, someone said something similar to them. I was dating this guy, and he said to me, almost in disgust, but in total frustration, Harriet, what is your obsession with race? That's all you talk about. You find it a way to get everything back to race. And it was such a shock because in our world, race was so prevalent. It was so part of everything that we did and we were aware of, that of course I was going to apply it to the rest of my life. And it was the first time it dawned on me that not everybody goes around thinking about race relations and what race discrimination. Still, I had things to learn. So as we go on, it's in the 90s. And you know how your mother always says, I don't want to have to tell you twice. Well, I had to be told twice, both by African Americans, different people. Second time I finally got it. And here's what I was told. We do not need a white savior. What? We don't need you to come in and save the Black people because you're better than us and you're going to come protect us. And then they gave a list of all the sorts of movies and stories, even the TV show Different Strokes, where Mr. Drummond goes into the ghetto to save 2 African Americans. And that was such a shock to me, because I thought, of course, that's what we're supposed to be doing, is saving the African Americans. So it was such a shock that that's not what I was supposed to be doing. And here's what I learned from when I got it the second time, I stopped talking. And when I stopped talking, I started listening a lot more, paying attention a lot more, because what I realized is that I had a lot of white guilt too, from all that stuff I was raised experiencing growing up. And what was happening with the white guilt, as Reverend Kevin Ross in Sacramento said, white people, you have to heal your white guilt. Because what happens when we don't heal our past, just as individually, when we don't heal our past, when I don't heal my white guilt, I wanted to fix them because I was so uncomfortable with my own pain. And if I could fix the problem out there, then I could feel a lot better about my own whiteness, about my own history, about my own ancestry. So it became an obsession. I was obsessed because it was actually avoiding how it made me feel to be aware of so much racism, and that I'm part of it. We're all part of it, Black and white. It takes two. This is not who's been in a relationship. A relationship cannot be healed. If you want a relationship to heal, you can't have only one person doing the work. Both groups need to be doing the work. We both need to be participating. We have different roles in it, but we all need to be participating in this. It is part of all of our history. Slavery is part of all of our history. It's not just the African American history, it's white history. It's the white history from 16, I think it was 19, came the first slaves, and through the just Civil War, Jim Crow, civil rights, we've been on this journey together the whole time. As if you are white like me, we have to own it. If you're a person of color, our job is to hear you, to listen. And so as I started listening, and this was in the 90s, the pain started impacting me more. I was outside my building, my office building, with a colleague. There's actually several of us out there, but a police car drives up, and my colleague's African American, and without saying a word, they threw him to the wall, patted him down, frisked him, said a few words, and took off. I was completely thrown. And then I was thrown because he had almost no reaction. No one else did. And I thought, well, that's so weird. And I kept thinking I missed something. So we went back up into the office, and so I asked, what did they say? Why did they do that? And they said some crime had happened nearby, and it was an African American man. So they would just threw him against the wall to make sure he wasn't the one. And I thought, well, they didn't have to do that. We're all with him. All they had to do was ask a question. They didn't ask a single question. They didn't say a single word to him. They just threw him against the wall. So before my eyes, I was seeing racism. When I stopped trying to fix it, when I stopped trying to control it and just feel and be present, it was horrible. And what was even more horrible was that this was normal. That the person who was thrown up against the wall goes, oh yeah, that happens all the time. Two different worlds that have been happening. Have you been hearing about that? Two different worlds. It's been going on for hundreds of years. It's changed and evolved, but two different worlds. It's a world I haven't lived in. It's a world my brothers and my boyfriends who are white have not had to live in. I heard stories as I started listening of Reverend Michael talking about his mother, how she taught him and his brothers that when they came home from school, this was all back in the 60s, make sure when you're stopped by the police officer, because of course you're going to be because you're a person of color, get their badge number, get their name so I could call the police department. I was shocked. That was just part of his everyday life, going to school in the morning or coming home. And we have since learned that this is a very common conversation that people of color have to have with their children, especially their male children, but all children, but especially the male children, because they tend to be picked on. It's a different reality. We let that in. We let the feelings and the pain of that reality to hit us, to enter into us. And no one can say Reverend Michael doesn't have the consciousness. Even as I was at Agape, I saw some very difficult racial things happen. And beyond, even after I left and went on my own, there are things that happened, and I got to see two people that I loved, Reverend Michael and Reverend Nirvana, and they had to find ways to both deal with their spiritual truth. They absolutely were committed to being unconditionally loving people, to stay in that unconditionally loving, and to be African Americans who have been treated at times with just extraordinary disdain in ways that we can't even imagine. Things said that they overhear. It's unbelievable. It's as a person who is not of color, it's still shocking to me, even though I witnessed it. Where do we go from here? We need to hear it. We need to feel it. What I experienced in my own healing with my emotional life is that I had to hear my feelings. I had to feel them, and it wasn't something that goes away overnight. One of the things Ayanna Van Sant was saying with Reverend Michael, they had a conversation this past week, and she was saying, we have to heal, all of us, heal our ancestral pain, whether it's white guilt or for the African Americans to heal the ancestral pain of being slaves and what was done. And that's a lot of work. But what's happening is when we're in the pain today, when you get stopped, if you're a person of color and you get stopped by police, it's not just that moment, it's 400 years of this. As Reverend Michael said, watching the murder on Thursday or Wednesday, it's in our DNA, that memory, the lynchings. We feel it viscerally. It's not just something we're watching. We feel it in our memory of our ancestral memory. So those are things, just as we do individually, we go to our past to heal. We go to our past to heal culturally. Again, it takes two. We are all having to do this healing. That's what's being called forth from us. How can we heal the past? How can we feel into it, feel our embarrassment? And I also do I'll get to that in a minute. So that's where we begin. We begin with recognizing how horrible what has been done. And then I think of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and then we get to the present tense. There's just been so much happening just this past week. The power of this week has been the people of color, African Americans specifically, feel validated that what they have been saying has been full on seen and experienced, that they're not just making it up. They're not just imagining racism. They're not just imagining, it's full on display. Because up until now, we have with people, Eric Garner, Rodney King, all these, Aubrey Ahmad, who was just murdered in February. First of all, he was murdered in February and nothing was done. Two solicitors saw the tapes and decided not to prosecute. It wasn't until the videotapes went viral that they prosecuted it, or picked up the two people who killed him, Aubrey Ahmad. That there's this feeling of these things are happening and nobody seems to be recognizing how bad it is. That it's almost like they're not telling the truth. That these things of discrimination are just being made up. It's like, again, going back to relationship. If you're in an abusive relationship, whether that abuse is your spouse is cheating, or your spouse is verbally abusive, or your spouse is physically abusive, but often what we see in those abusive type relationships is the one who's doing the abusing will manipulate the person who's being abused and saying, oh no, it's not that bad. You're just making that up, or you're crazy. I don't know why you think that I'm sleeping with somebody else. That's crazy. or I don't know why, no, or I know I've hurt you, but that's not who I am. That was a mistake. I was really upset, but who I really am is I love you. And you need to just sort of put that aside and recognize that I love you, and put all that abuse aside, all that manipulation aside. And so we see that dynamic happening a lot in relationships. And that's sometimes what I understand African Americans may feel about what's been happening is the pain is being shared, they're sharing it, and there's always sort of an excuse as to why it's happening. And that did begin with Rodney King, because that's the first time I really saw videotape, and everything was excused of why he needed to be beaten, why that was a legal and justifiable reaction was to beat him. That's when it began. And so there's this memory that comes up. So when we get to a situation like this week, there's no reason. When we saw, well, there's two experiences. When we saw George Floyd, the officer who took his life was not in danger. It wasn't oh my gosh, if I don't do this, I'm going to lose my life, or I'm going to even get hurt or injured. No, none of that was going to happen. He was calm, he was cool, he was collected, and he kept his knee on that man's neck, on George Floyd's neck. If that doesn't devastate you to watch that, to tear you apart of what human beings are capable of, it's not on a TV show, it's not something that had to happen. It was done out of cruelty, out of hate. And I immediately saw my friends from high school, their reactions were not sadness. Their reactions immediately were rage. It's like, I'm tired of forgiving this. I'm tired of loving my enemies. I'm tired of praying about it. We've been doing that for decades. We've been doing this for my community since we were kids. We've been doing this work, and it just keeps showing up, and the violence just keeps coming, and nothing happens. So then we get into the protests. And the protests, and I know all of you are reading as much as I am. There's so many different perspectives on why the protests are happening, infiltrators, but it's pain and it's rage. And as Trevor Noah said, the social contract was broken, that the police officers continue to hurt African Americans. They're not keeping their side of the contract up to keep people of color safe. In fact, they're the ones doing the hurting. So there's a rage because there's no other way to deal with all these emotions. As I'm sure you've all heard the Martin Luther King quote, rebellion is the language of the unseen. Rebellion is the language of the invisible. They've been saying it and saying it. So one of the things that Reverend Kevin Ross said, he's a Unity minister in Sacramento, he's African American, and he said to me, to all white people, we need you to start talking to each other. We need you to start sharing that this isn't okay and doing your own healing work. We need you to heal your white guilt, because you can't show up in love to be a healing presence for us if you're showing up only to heal your own stuff. If you're showing up to heal your own stuff, then it's suddenly you're showing up because for your own good and not for the good of us. And we need you. We've been talking. We have been saying everything that we can possibly say to the police system, to the justice system, and no one is hearing us. It's not working. We need you to be our allies, to walk with us, not to save us, but to walk with us, to join us in this healing process. And so we have that call for those of us who are white to join those of you who are people of color, to join together in a process of healing. It does require us maybe to do separate work, but to come together in doing that healing work in the present tense, to feel the emotions in the present tense, and to work together so something does change, so something is resolved. I remember years ago when I was in 8th grade, I read Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And I don't remember anything about the book other than one thing that she said, and it stuck with me. She was writing before the Civil War, and she was writing about slavery. And she said, there's been hundreds of years of slavery, hundreds. This is multi-generations, not just one generation, not just two generations, multi-generations of taking human lives, selling them like cattle, and then not only selling them like cattle, but taking their children from them and selling their children. She said, if anyone thinks that if slavery were to end tomorrow, that the healing was going to happen at the same time, they haven't understand human nature. She said, it's going to take generations upon generations to heal what is being done today. It can't heal overnight. You can't heal that level of destruction of the human connection, of that deep family connection for generation upon generation upon generation. And then even after slavery ends, we know there's Jim Crow. We know that there was still so much discrimination, which the civil rights came along. And we know that there's racism that I just was sharing, and so many stories. It's still so alive and prevalent. It's not going to be healed overnight. And the rage isn't going to be healed overnight, but we can do the spiritual work together. We can open our heart to the divine, because the divine is greater than all of this. The divine love is right here in the midst of it. The divine love is in the midst of the protest. The divine love, I love that Iyanla Vanzant, when she was praising George Floyd for, she feels like he gave his soul for the healing, to call this forth at this time, that he stood for something, and he was part of a ministry back in Houston. We are being called by the divine. And as a white person, we are also being called as white people. We had the experience just a few days earlier with Amy Cooper. I'm sure most of you have heard this as well. She was in New York City Park. She identifies herself as a sort of liberal Democrat, completely for all equality, for all people, no questions, until she came to a place where she felt unsafe in Central Park with an African-American man who was bird watching. And her first reaction, and I like the word that I heard Trevor Noah use, is she weaponized race. Her first reaction was to call the police and say, there is a Black man who is threatening me, because she knew how that was going to be received by the police department. She knew what that meant culturally. She knew that she would be more believed than the African-American man. That was her way of getting what she wanted and what she needed. This was another validation for the people of color community, because I have heard many times, it's very nice that you say that you don't see race, or you don't see color, or you don't judge people by the color of their skin, but they feel it. They feel that on the surface it's one thing, but underneath, when it came to that moment, she called and she weaponized color. She weaponized race, because deep down she hadn't really done the work. There was still seeing African American. She was still seeing a Black man in front of her, and used that to her advantage. So as a white person, for those of you who are white, we have to look at ourselves. How deep does our healing go? How much have we healed our sense of separation, of feeling better than or superior than a person of color? Because we have been told subtly, maybe not overtly, although sometimes overtly, but definitely subtly, by all the images, by all the things that we read, just by the very fact that in school we read all white authors. Maybe once or twice there was an African-American author. I had maybe one or two female authors, but most of the authors we read in school, white authors. We have been the messages, the advertisements, it's all changing now. Thank goodness it's changing. But the messages that we've gotten since when we were kids is that there is a superiority to the white race. That's been part of this cultural collective unconsciousness. And we totally disagree with that. I know that in our minds. But what I learned as I was doing my emotional work, it didn't matter what my mind thought. My heart, my subconscious had a lot of other stuff going on that had to be healed. And it couldn't be healed until I owned it, till I felt it, until I experienced it. So we are all being called to do this work. We can't wait. Too many lives are dying, and it's not okay. You know, for me, it's not okay. It's just not okay. It's not okay not to do the work. It's not okay not to show up. And so then we say, well, what do we do? Well, there's a ton of tools that I've been amazed at the amount of things that I've read this past week. They've always been there, but there's so many tools that we can start opening up to heal, do our own interior work individually and collectively, so that the past is healed, so we can, when issues come up in the present, it's just the present tense. We know that in relationships, that when our relationship, we heal the stuff in our past. So when a conflict comes up, present tense in the relationship, we're just dealing with that and not all the stuff in the past. We have to do all that work. And the African American community, the people of color community, you can't do it by yourselves. Those of us who are white have to join you. We have to engage. That's the call from this week. That's the call that we all have. Get on social media, see all the tools that are available. I'll try to start posting more and more of them on my Facebook page. But we are being called. This can't keep happening. It's been happening for decades. And two more things. It is tiring. One of the things that I've learned about my own emotional life is that it's always there. So when we're saying deal with the present tense, the only way I can deal with the present tense if yesterday I did my work. So that's why I do my spiritual practices. I open to what my emotional life and vibration is every day, because I need to stay with it. And so that's the thing with race. I think sometimes when we say heal, we think, okay, I'm healed it, now it's done and I don't have to think about it. One of the things we have to grasp is that this is going to be something that we are being with, a vibration and a frequency as a culture for the rest of our lives. It's not something that we just do once and it's over, or we do for a period of years and it's over. This is a dynamic that has been going on for hundreds of years. It's going to take at least our lifetime to be present with it. So we find a way to be with it on an everyday basis. My journaling is a way for me to be with myself, find practices that nurture us. We're in it for the long haul. The reason why I told about my past is because, that was 40 years ago, I'm 54. This has been a reality that I've been thinking about as a white person, which isn't even close to being a person of color, for 30, 40 years. It's not going away. We're in it for the long haul. So as I'm saying, we're to do the work. This isn't about doing the work instantly and it's all going to be gone. It's becoming about a way of life. My spiritual practice is for my own healing. It's a way of life. Now we find practices to help us heal this divide between, well, we're always creating separation. That's something human beings do. But this issue, if you're an American, if you identify with the American culture and identity at all, we're all part of this history. We're all part of this history of separation, deep, powerful, painful separation. So we have to be part of the process of healing it and bringing it together on a daily basis. And lastly, I want to say something that I got from Ryan Bath, who is an actress on First Wives Club on BET. Her husband is Sterling K. Brown on This Is Us, an African-American couple raising two African-American boys. And Reverend Michael was talking with her about teaching them how to take care of themselves, and really ingraining the idea that this is a safe world, it's a world of love. One of the things that she said, in the midst of everything else, it can get so heavy. So the thing that they've brought to their home, and the boys are little, is joy. So they have something they call Black Boy Joy. I love that, Black Boy Joy. And that is a thing in their house that they are absolutely committed to laughing, to giggling, to playing games, to being silly, to hugging and kissing, and to feel the joy of life. And so that as I'm talking about doing this healing work, it gets so heavy, and it can be so heavy. And we have to remind ourselves that that's why we do the spiritual stuff, because the spiritual stuff, the moment we bring spirit into it, lightness comes into being, play comes into being, joy comes into being. It doesn't mean that the healing doesn't need to happen. So I can feel light and joyful and free, and I can do the healing work. Do we see? So we want to carry both of those together, doing the spiritual work, but not doing the spiritual work where we do spiritual bypass and pretend we're okay. But we also don't want to live so much in the stuff that we forget the infinite joy and the lightness of being and the freedom and the creativity that is always available to us in every single moment, every single day. I remember when I was a child, and then I was going to therapy, and my brothers were saying, but you were so happy. And my parents, you're so happy growing up. There's no sense of it. Let's not confuse. You can be completely happy. and completely full of joy and still have deep things that need to be healed. That's where we are. That's what's happening. Thank you for having the courage to show up, to be here this morning, to open your heart, to listen. And may we all go forth and listen more, because again, the more we listen, the more we allow the spirit of presence to come in and heal all of us. We are in this together. We walk together as individuals and as one. We are in this together. Thank you for being with me this beautiful morning as we collectively send out our connections and love for the entire planet, the healing that is happening now. So let's go into prayer as we give thanks for the power and the presence of pure love, of pure joy, of pure wisdom, of pure peace, harmony, grace, all that has ever been and ever will be. It is right here and right now. It is unlimited. It is infinite. It is eternal. It is unwavering. There is no condition or circumstance on this planet that ever can limit or hurt or endanger or touch this beautiful presence of pure spirit. And this is the place from which we start. This is the place from which we live every single one of our days, anchored in this absolute truth of unconditional love, of unlimited peace, of infinite harmony, of infinite joy. We stand in that. We live from that. And then from that place, it is safe for us to feel whatever needs to be felt, to hear whatever needs to be heard, so that healing energy, so this light, this love can come and infuse these conditions and circumstances, infuse our emotional life, infuse our physical body, infuse our culture, infuse our planet with its light, with its love, with its healing presence. We open ourselves and make ourselves available, knowing that we are safe because this is a friendly universe. It is infinitely good, and we are one with it now. We are one with it now. And from this place, we give thanks. We give thanks for the life of George Lloyd and all those who have come before him, knowing that their lives were never given in vain, that their lives are remembered, respected, and valued and celebrated. We give thanks for the outplaying between Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper, knowing that that is teaching us something that we need to learn. And we have the humility and the humbleness to learn. We are willing to learn and open and heal and allow the divine presence in our humbleness, in our listening, in our hearing. We say yes to the divine and allow its full sway into our heart and heal every single one of us, individually and collectively. For those of us who are white, we bless our people of color, our African American brothers and sisters, as even they are blessed in their life and their journey. And we bless knowing that our journeys, we walk together in our own individual uniqueness, in our own individual power, in our own individual grace. And we come together in this extraordinary love, in this love where nothing can ever separate us, because it is the love of God. We are that now. We are more loving in our heart. It is done right here, right now, in the invisible, in the infinite and eternal one. And we are the space where it is happening and unfolding perfectly in our physical, emotional, and mental lives right here and right now. In deep abiding gratitude, we let this word be. And I invite us all to say together now, and so it is. Amen and amen.